What do you think will remain of you when you're gone? Not your money, not your titles, not the things you spent years working for. Not the car you drove, the house you lived in, or the balance in your bank account. If someone sat down years from now and spoke of you, what would they say? I once met a man who had built an empire, a fortune large enough to ensure that he would never know a single day of financial worry. He had power, influence, a name that carried weight in rooms filled with important people. But when I met him, none of that mattered anymore. He was alone, sitting in a quiet nursing home, staring out the window as if waiting for something that would never come. I built a business, he told me, his voice carrying a kind of resignation that only comes when a person finally sees the truth too late. But I never built a family. He didn't say it as a dramatic confession. There was no bitterness in his voice, no anger at the choices he had made. Just a simple, undeniable truth that had settled into his bones. A truth that he had spent a lifetime ignoring. But now, in the stillness of his later years, it had become impossible to escape. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades making deals, growing his company, securing his future, believing that one day, when he had enough, he would finally slow down, spend time with the people who mattered. But one day never came, and when he finally looked up from his work, the people who once waited for him had moved on. I sat with him for a long time, letting the quiet stretch between us. And in that silence, I couldn't help but wonder, how many of us are walking the same path without even realizing it? We convince ourselves that we're working hard for the people we love, that the long hours, the missed birthdays, the unreturned calls are all just temporary sacrifices, that we're building something important, something necessary. But what if, in the process, we're losing something far more valuable? There's an old Buddhist teaching that says, in the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of the things not meant for you. But how many of us are loving deeply, living gently, and letting go of what doesn't serve us? Or are we holding on to things that, in the grand scheme of life, won't matter at all? There was a woman in the same nursing home, a woman named Margaret. She didn't have a fortune, didn't have a famous name, but every afternoon, without fail, her room was filled with warmth. Her children, her grandchildren, even old students she had once taught, all coming back to see her. They brought her flowers, held her hands, told her stories about their lives. And she smiled, not because she had everything, but because she had enough. I watched them laugh together, watched as one of her grandchildren curled up beside her and rested their head on her shoulder, and I thought, this is what remains. Not the things we owned, not the money we made, not the titles we earned, but the love we gave. And if today were your last, what would remain of you? There's a certain kind of silence that lingers in a room when a person realizes they have everything they ever worked for, except someone to share it with. It's not the peaceful kind of silence, nor the kind that comes from deep contemplation. No, this silence is different. It carries the weight of what was lost along the way. The unspoken words, the missed embraces, the laughter that could have been. I once met a man whose life, from the outside, seemed like a grand success. He had built a thriving business from scratch, turning it into an empire. His name was spoken with respect in boardrooms, and his wealth could afford him anything he desired. But when I asked about his family, a shadow passed over his face. I built a business, he said, his voice steady but distant, but I never built a family. He didn't say it as a dramatic confession, nor did he look for pity. It was simply a truth that had settled into his bones. A truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding, but now, in the stillness of his later years, it had become impossible to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades making deals, growing his company, securing his financial future, believing that one day, when he had enough, he would finally make time for his loved ones. But one day never came. Life had a way of slipping through his fingers, and by the time he looked up from his work, the people who once waited for him had moved on. I sat with him for a long time, letting the quiet stretch between us. And in that silence, I wondered, how many of us are walking the same path without even realizing it? We tell ourselves that we're working hard for the sake of our families, that the long hours, the late nights, The missed birthdays and unreturned calls are all justified because we're building a future. But what is a future without the people we love? What happens when we finally arrive at the destination, only to find that no one is there waiting for us? Aging has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. The illusions fall away, and all that remains are the things that truly mattered. And in the nursing home where I spent time, I saw that what mattered most was never the size of one's bank account or the number of awards hanging on the wall. It was the warmth of a hand to hold, the presence of someone who cared, the simple joy of knowing you were not alone. There was an old woman who sat by the window every morning, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road outside. "Maybe today," she would whisper. "Maybe today my son will visit." But he never did. First, I thought she was waiting for him. But over time, I realized she wasn't just waiting for her son. She was waiting to matter again. She had spent her life loving him, raising him, making sacrifices so he could have a better life. But as the years passed, life pulled him in another direction. Responsibilities, work, a family of his own. The calls became less frequent, the visits even rarer. She never blamed him. She never said a word against him, but the longing in her eyes told a different story. It was the kind of ache that had settled deep into her bones, an ache that no amount of comfort or distraction could ease. Loneliness isn't just about being alone. It's about feeling invisible, about realizing that the people you once built your life around no longer see you in the same way. I often wonder how many of us are unknowingly creating the same fate for ourselves. How often do we assume that the people who love us will always be there, waiting for us to have time? How many phone calls have we put off? How many small moments have we let slip away, believing there will always be another chance? There's an old Buddhist parable about a man running through a dense forest, being chased by a tiger. Desperate to escape, he stumbles upon a vine hanging over a cliff and grabs onto it. Below him, another tiger waits, pacing hungrily. As he clings to the vine, two mice, one white, one black, begin gnawing at it. He realizes the vine won't hold for long. Just then, he notices a wild strawberry growing within reach. He plucks it, takes a bite, and tastes the sweetest fruit he has ever known. The tigers are birth and death always looming. The mice, one white and one black, symbolize the passage of time, day and night, slowly eating away at our days. And yet, in the midst of it all, there are moments of sweetness. But how often do we pause long enough to taste them? There was another man in the nursing home, one who had lived a very different kind of life. His name was George. He had never built a fortune, never lived in a grand house, never had his name etched into the halls of power. But every day, without fail, someone came to visit him. Former students, old friends, neighbors. They brought books, stories, laughter. "You know what's funny?" he said to me one afternoon, a twinkle in his eye. "I never made much money, but when I see these kids come back to see me, I know I was the richest man in the world." And I believed him, because at the end of life, no one sits in their final moments wishing they had spent more time at the office. No one longs for another business deal, another award, another zero in their bank account. They long for the warmth of love, for the presence of someone who cares. The man who built an empire had everything except the one thing that mattered most. The woman by the window had given all her love, only to be forgotten. And George, with no material wealth to speak of, had built a legacy of love that would outlast him. We are all building something. The only question is, what? Are we building walls between ourselves and the people who love us? Are we constructing a life so busy, so full of distractions, that we forget to be present for the ones who matter most? Or are we choosing, even in small ways, to build something that will hold us in the end? A hand to reach for, a voice that says, "I'm here," a life that, when all is said and done, is rich not in things but in love. And if today were your last, would you be at peace with what you've built? There was a man I once knew, a man whose life had been the kind others admired. He had traveled the world, worn the finest suits, dined in restaurants where a single meal cost more than most people made in a week. His name carried weight in business circles, His decisions shaped industries, and his wealth could buy almost anything. Almost. Now, he sat in a chair by the window of a quiet room, his trembling hands struggling to lift a spoon to his mouth. "I spent my life chasing money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what is freedom if you don't have the strength to enjoy it?" His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of realization. He had worked tirelessly to build a life he could no longer fully live. The luxuries he had once indulged in were now distant memories. The private jets, the gala dinners, the endless meetings, all of it had led him here, to a moment where the simple act of feeding himself had become an effort. It's strange, isn't it? We sacrifice our health for wealth, believing that one day we'll have time to enjoy the fruits of our labor. But what if that day never comes? I remember another conversation with a woman whose eyes carried the quiet sadness of an unfulfilled dream. She had always longed to return to Italy, to walk the cobblestone streets of Florence again, to stand beneath the grandeur of the Sistine Chapel, to taste the wine from the vineyards she had visited in her youth. "I always thought there would be time," she sighed. "But by the time I had the money, my legs could no longer carry me." She had waited too long. And now, the dream remained a dream, a whisper of what could have been. How many of us are doing the same? Putting off the things that bring us joy, telling ourselves that someday we'll slow down, take care of ourselves, listen to what our bodies are trying to tell us? But the body, like time, is not a patient teacher. It does not wait for us to be ready. It moves forward, changing, deteriorating, slipping through our fingers while we are too busy to notice. There is an old Buddhist teaching that compares the body to a borrowed house. We live in it for a while, take shelter in it, move through life within its walls. But one day, the house will begin to crumble. No matter how much we try to repair it, no matter how many decorations we add, the foundation will eventually weaken. And when the time comes, we must leave it behind. But how do we treat this house while we have it? Do we care for it, honor it, treat it with kindness? Or do we neglect it, overwork it, fill it with toxins, push it beyond its limits, assuming that it will always be there to serve us? I once heard a story about a farmer who owned a strong and loyal horse. The horse had carried him through storms, plowed his fields, and taken him to distant markets. It was his most valuable companion. But as the years went by, the farmer became greedy. He pushed the horse harder, made it work longer hours, fed it less, believing that as long as the work got done, everything was fine. Until one day the horse collapsed. No amount of regret could bring it back. We do this to ourselves, don't we? We demand more and more from our bodies, ignoring the signals, brushing off the fatigue, the headaches, the stress, thinking that rest is something we will get to later. Until later is too late. There was another man I met, a man who had once been a dancer. He spoke of the stage, of the feeling of moving effortlessly, of how, when he danced, it felt like he was weightless. But now, his body refused to obey him. The strength had left his legs, the fluidity had faded from his movements. "I always thought I'd have more time to dance," he told me. "But I spent more time watching others dance than doing it myself." I wonder how many of us are doing the same, watching life from the sidelines, convincing ourselves that one day we will start living. The Buddha once said, "Every human being is the author of their own health or disease. It is not fate or luck that determines our well-being, but the choices we make every day. The food we eat, the way we move, the hours we allow ourselves to rest. But more than that, it is the way we value ourselves. Do we see our bodies as sacred vessels, worthy of care, deserving of kindness? Or do we treat them as tools, as machines, as things to be used up and discarded?" I think of all the people I met in that nursing home, people who had once been strong, vibrant, full of life. And I think of all the dreams they had postponed, the things they had planned to do once they had time. And I wonder, what if we didn't wait? What if, instead of treating our health as something secondary, we made it a priority? What if we started listening, truly listening, to what our bodies were telling us? I once saw an old Zen proverb that said, "When you walk, just walk. When you eat, just eat." It is a reminder to be present, to slow down, to stop rushing through life as if the only thing that matters is reaching some distant goal. Because at the end of it all, no amount of money can buy back a body that has been pushed beyond repair. No amount of regret can undo the years of neglect. No postponed vacation, no long-awaited dream, no well-earned retirement can turn back the clock. The only thing we will have left is the way we treated ourselves along the way. So I ask you, if your body were speaking to you right now, what would it say? Would it thank you for taking care of it, for honoring it, for giving it the rest and nourishment it needs? Or would it whisper, I wish you had listened sooner, the weight of what we own? There was a man I met once, a man whose life had been adorned with every luxury one could imagine. He had lived in a house perched on the cliffs, where the ocean stretched infinitely before him, its waves kissing the shore in an endless rhythm. Inside that house were rooms filled with expensive paintings, rare sculptures, and furniture carved from the finest wood. He had collected art from Paris, watches from Switzerland, and suits tailored to perfection. But now all of that was gone. He sat in a small room, his worldly possessions reduced to a single wooden drawer beside his bed. He reached inside, fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out an old photograph, him and his wife, decades ago, standing under the golden sun of their youth. I spent my life filling my house with things, he murmured. But in the end, the only thing I treasure is this. His voice carried no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had come to understand something too late. I watched him run his thumb over the faded edges of the photo, as if trying to hold onto a moment long gone. And in that instant, I saw what he saw. Not the riches he had once possessed, but the love he had lost in the pursuit of them. How many of us are doing the same? We chase after things, bigger houses, shinier cars, newer gadgets, believing that somehow they will fill the space within us. We measure success by the weight of our wallets, the brands on our clothing, the square footage of our homes. But when all of that is stripped away, what is left? There is a story from Buddhist tradition about a wealthy merchant who, on his deathbed, realized that he had spent his entire life accumulating gold, but had never cultivated generosity. In his final moments, he lamented, I built a grand house, but I never built a home. I filled my hands, but I left my heart empty. It makes me wonder, are we collecting possessions, or are we collecting moments? There was another person I met, an old woman named Margaret. Unlike the man with the Ocean View mansion, she had never owned anything extravagant. She had lived in a modest house, raised 3 children, worked as a schoolteacher. Her home had been filled not with expensive art, but with the sound of laughter, the smell of warm meals, the simple joy of being together. I don't miss what I never had, she told me with a gentle smile, but I cherish every meal we shared, every story we laughed over. That's my treasure. And you know what? That's enough. She didn't have wealth in the way the world defines it. But in her final years, her children still visited her every week. Her grandchildren ran into her arms with joy. Former students sent her letters, telling her how she had changed their lives. And I wondered, who was richer? At the end of our lives, we won't measure our days by the things we owned, but by the love we gave and received. The question is, what are we investing in? Things that will fade or connections that will last? The burden we carry. There was a woman in the nursing home who carried something heavier than her years. Not in her hands, but in her heart. She had not spoken to her sister in over 2 decades. I thought we had more time, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But one day never came. She tried to remember what had started it. A disagreement over something small, a few words spoken in frustration, the kind of thing that, at the time, felt important. But now, all she could remember was the silence that followed. She had waited for her sister to call first, waited for an apology, waited for the right moment to fix things. But that moment never arrived. And now, the only thing left was regret. I thought of a Buddhist teaching I once heard. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. How often do we hold on to resentment, convincing ourselves that we are protecting our pride, when in reality we are only hurting ourselves? There was an elderly man named George who shared a similar story. He and his best friend had a falling out over a business dispute. "We were like brothers," he said, shaking his head. "But we let money come between us. We said things we couldn't take back. And then life happened. We got busy, too stubborn to admit we missed each other. Years passed, then decades. George built a life, had a family. But in the quiet moments, his mind always wandered back to his old friend. One day, I finally decided to reach out," he continued, his voice softer now. "But by then it was too late. He had passed away. And just like that, all the anger, all the resentment, it meant nothing. I thought of my own life, the arguments left unresolved, the apologies left unspoken, the relationships that had faded not because they weren't important, but because no one made the first move. How many of us are carrying burdens that should have been set down long ago?" There's a story of two Buddhist monks who were traveling together. Along the way, they came across a woman struggling to cross a river. One of the monks hesitated, knowing that their vows prohibited them from touching a woman. But the other monk simply lifted her onto his back, carried her across, and set her down on the other side. Hours later, as they continued their journey, the first monk finally blurted out, "How could you do that? We are not supposed to touch women." The other monk simply smiled and said, "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" How many of us are still carrying things we should have let go of long ago? How many sleepless nights have we spent replaying old arguments, nursing grudges, convincing ourselves that we were right? But in the end, does it really matter? Forgiveness is not about excusing what happened. It's not about pretending that pain doesn't exist. It's about freeing ourselves from the chains of bitterness. It's about choosing peace over pride. Because time does not wait for us to be ready. If there is someone you need to forgive, yourself or someone else, what is stopping you? If today were your last day, would you want to leave this world carrying that weight? Or would you rather set it down and walk forward lighter, freer, at peace? There was an old man I once met, a man whose life had been full of stories, some joyful, some bittersweet, but all of them woven together in a way that made him who he was. His name was Robert, and he had lived 82 years on this earth, but if you had listened to him that evening, you would have thought he was still a boy. As we sat in the dim glow of the nursing home's common room, he told me about the summers of his childhood, climbing trees so high that the world seemed small beneath him. He spoke of skipping stones across a lake, watching as they danced on the water before disappearing. And then, with a wistful smile, he shared the story of the first time he ever danced with his wife. "I always thought I had time," he said, swirling his cup of tea as if he could stir the past back to life. "Time to take my wife to Paris like I promised. Time to fix the fence in the backyard. Time to call my brother and tell him I was sorry." But the next morning, Robert was gone. And all those one-day plans, all those things he had meant to do, died with him. It made me wonder, how many of us live as if we have an infinite supply of tomorrows? How often do we say, "One day, I'll do this. Someday, I'll make things right. Eventually, I'll slow down and enjoy life," without realizing that time is not something we own, only something we borrow. There is an old Zen proverb that says, "When you walk, just walk. When you eat, just eat." It's a reminder that life is happening right now, not in some distant future when conditions are perfect. But most of us don't live this way. We rush through meals distracted by our phones. We walk without noticing the sky, the trees, the air filling our lungs. We spend our days worrying about what's next, forgetting to be present for what's now. I met a woman once, Eleanor, who had always dreamed of writing a book. "I had the idea in my head for years," she told me. "But first I had work, then kids, then grandkids, and I kept telling myself, someday, when life slows down, I'll finally write it." She looked down at her trembling hands. But life never slowed down, and now my hands shake too much to hold a pen. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of all the unwritten words, all the stories that would never be told. I thought of a Buddhist teaching that compares life to a candle burning in the wind. It flickers, it dances, it glows, but at any moment, a strong breeze could come and extinguish it. We don't get to choose how long our candle will burn, but we do get to choose how brightly it shines while it's still lit. If you love someone, tell them today. If you have a dream, take the first step now. If there's something you've been putting off, an apology, a phone call, a long overdue adventure, don't wait, because tomorrow is never promised. There was another person I met in the nursing home, an elderly woman named Alice. She was different from most of the others. She never complained, never spoke of regrets. While some people sat in silence, lost in what they had lost, she greeted each morning with quiet contentment. "I wake up and I'm grateful," she told me one day. "I can still feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. That's enough." She said it with such sincerity that for a moment, I envied her. While others longed for what had passed, she found peace in what remained. It made me think of a Buddhist teaching, how suffering often comes from craving, from the insatiable desire for what we don't have. But contentment comes from shifting our focus to what we do have. There was another man I met, James, who had once been an accomplished pianist. Arthritis had taken away his ability to play, and at first the loss devastated him. I used to ask, "Why me?" he admitted. But one day, I decided to stop mourning what I had lost and start appreciating what I still had. I may not be able to play anymore, but I can still listen to music. I can still feel its rhythm, its emotion. And for that, I am grateful. Both Alice and James had found a profound truth. Life will always take things away from us. Our bodies will weaken, our circumstances will change, and one day we will lose everything. But we still have the present moment. And there is always something to be grateful for if we choose to see it. I once heard a question that stayed with me. If tomorrow you woke up with only the things you were grateful for today, what would remain? Would you still have your health? Would you still have your loved ones? Would you still have the ability to see, to hear, to walk, to breathe? Or have we been so focused on what we lack that we have forgotten to appreciate what we already have? Gratitude is not about saying thank you as a formality. It is about truly living in appreciation of the life we have right now. I sometimes think about Robert, about all the things he had planned to do one day, and I think about Alice, who found joy in the simple act of feeling the sun on her skin. One spent his days chasing a future that never came. The other embraced the present, knowing that every moment was a gift. So I wonder, if today was your last, would you be at peace with how you lived? There was a woman I met once, a woman whose presence filled the room with a quiet warmth. Her name was Margaret. She wasn't someone who had built a vast empire or made headlines. She had never owned a mansion, never worn designer dresses, never accumulated vast riches. But if you had seen her, surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, and even former students who still came to visit her, you would have known instantly. She was rich in a way that truly mattered. Every afternoon, like clockwork, her small room would be filled with the hum of conversation, with laughter spilling out into the hallways. Her grandchildren would sit at her feet, playing with her hands, telling her about their day. Her children would bring her favorite tea, adjusting her pillows with gentle hands. And sometimes, an old student, now an adult with a life of their own, would come back just to say, "Mrs. Margaret, you changed my life." She didn't have gold, but she had something far more valuable, love that echoed in the lives she had touched. Then there were others, people who had once been powerful, successful, respected in their industries. They had built companies, owned skyscrapers, made fortunes that most could only dream of. But now their rooms were silent. No voices, no laughter, no gentle hands adjusting their pillows. Some of them had children who rarely visited. Others had outlived their families, watching as time slowly took away everything they had worked for. Their success had bought them the best medical care, the finest food, a private room in the most comfortable wing of the nursing home. But it couldn't buy them the presence of a loved one sitting beside them when the nights felt long. It made me wonder, what are we really building? There is an old Buddhist teaching that says, if you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it. Love, like light, is the only thing that grows the more you give it away. Yet so many of us spend our lives chasing things that fade, forgetting to nurture the only thing that truly lasts. There was an elderly man named Henry the first once spoke to. He had spent his entire life focused on work, convinced that providing for his family meant working harder, earning more, securing their future. I thought success meant giving them everything money could buy, he admitted. But I missed birthdays. I missed anniversaries. I missed the small moments that mattered most. He had been a provider, but he had not been present. And now, in the quiet of his later years, he realized they would have preferred fewer things and more of him. It's easy to believe that love is something we can always come back to, that relationships will wait for us while we focus on more important things. But love, much like time, does not pause just because we are too busy. There's a story from ancient times about a man who spent his whole life searching for the meaning of wealth. He traveled from city to city, gathering gold, jewels, and treasures, believing that if he could just accumulate enough, he would finally feel fulfilled. One day, he met an old monk who was sitting quietly under a tree, smiling to himself. "What are you so happy about?" the rich man asked. The monk simply pointed at the sky. "Do you see the sun?" "Of course," the man replied. "And does the sun lose its light when it shares it with the world?" The man frowned. "No, it shines just the same." The monk chuckled. "Then why do you hoard your wealth as if giving it away would make you poor? Love is the same. The more you give it, the more it grows. The more you hold on to it, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to express it, the more it slips through your fingers." Margaret had understood something that Henry had only realized too late. We do not take anything with us when we go. Not our money, not our possessions. The only thing that remains is the love we gave and the lives we touched. I think about this often, about the people we choose to prioritize, about the way we spend our days, about whether we are investing in things that will truly matter in the end. Are we making time for the people we love? Or are we always too busy? Are we showing up, not just in big ways but in small, everyday moments? Are we saying, "I love you" enough? Or are we assuming people already know? Because one day, we will look back and realize that love was the only thing that ever really belonged to us. And I wonder what will remain of the life we lived once we are gone. At the end of life, we don't ask for our bank statements. We don't ask to see our trophies, our promotions, our expensive possessions. We ask for people. We ask for the voices that once called our name with love. We ask for the hands we once held. We ask for the laughter we once shared, the memories that made life feel meaningful. But what if, when that time comes, there is no one left to answer? I think of Henry, the man who had spent his entire life providing for his family, believing that financial success was the greatest gift he could give them. He had built a life of security, but in the process, he had missed the life itself. "I thought they needed more things," he admitted, "but they just needed more of me." I think of the woman who sat by the window every morning, whispering, "Maybe today," as she waited for a son who never came. I think of the people who had chased success, only to realize too late that they had been running in the wrong direction. And then I think of Margaret, who had built no empire but had built a home in the hearts of the people she loved. Margaret, whose name was not in the newspapers but was spoken with warmth by the people who sat beside her bed. Margaret, who had given love freely, and in return was never alone. It makes me wonder, what are we investing in? Are we spending our lives chasing things that will fade? Or are we building something that will last? Are we nurturing the relationships that will hold us when everything else falls away? Or are we letting life slip through our fingers, believing we'll always have more time? Love is the only thing that multiplies when it's shared. It is the only thing we can leave behind that will truly remain. So, if today were your last, would you be at peace with the life you've built? Would you be remembered for what you owned, or for how you loved? And if you had only one more chance to say something to the people who matter to you, what would you say? Because this is what will last. And the real question is, what will remain of you once you are gone?